Let's begin, Dr Scamps, hearing what you've heard from your constituents. I'd be interested too whether the concerns are the same as when you first ran for federal parliament.
Thank you, and I just want to say thanks to Neil as well, Uncle Neil. Every time you give a beautiful welcome, I think we all learn something new, and it's always an extremely generous welcome, so thank you so much for that. I think we know things have changed a bit, haven't they, over the last couple of years, because absolutely when we go out and speak to people, cost of living is the number one issue that is really hitting people hard at the moment. And we've been knocking on business doors as well just to hear from them, because we know it is a tough time, and hearing that it is exactly that, a hard time. So we're doing what we can as well to support business. Cost of living, housing is another huge issue. Housing has long been an issue, but I think it's really the rubber's hitting the road on that one. I think most people across our community, across our society, are realising it's a real problem for the next generation in particular. That intergenerational inequality is going to affect us all, and it's splitting up families. When I was a GP, I used to hear that, young families moving out of the area, but it's happening more and more. And so our networks and our families are being split. And mental health feeds into that as well. And in the background, there's always strong support for more action on climate and environment in this electorate. Yeah.
There are young people here this afternoon. Can you, in any way, feed into the housing stock issue, the rents and the housing availability for younger families in this region?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's been a number of measures that we've had to vote on in Parliament already, and I've supported everything that we can do to increase supply. So the government has actually brought forward quite a number of different bits of legislation around the Housing Australia Future Fund to increase social housing, to increase affordable housing for frontline workers. Another one of the issues we're finding in this area is it's very hard to attract teachers to the area, to attract nurses to the area, all those types of things, the frontline workers, because they're finding it harder and harder to live in the area, and then you'd have to travel from a long distance to come into this area. But there's a lot that is going on, and we recently held for housing, because we know it's such a big issue, we held a housing people's jury. What do people here in this electorate want me to be representing? How do they want me to be representing them in Canberra? So we made sure that that was really a representative sample. So we were able to hear from young people in that forum as well, and I think we'll probably speak about that a little bit more. But absolutely, there's a lot that can be done, and I think it goes beyond just supply. Supply is a massive part of what is happening, but it also goes on to how we treat housing. Is it a form of shelter that everyone deserves to be able to afford, or is it an investment choice? So that's a massive debate that needs to be had. Yeah. You
said that there is the issue of climate change hangs over the world, our species and others. I heard just this weekend an excellent Robin Williams on the ABC Science program rounding up the latest scientific opinion that perhaps this movement of over 95 million people across borders, unprecedented, but already the displacement forecast is so great that just thinking about border security is not going to do it. We have to start investing in those areas where the displacement is going to come from, which includes our Pacific region. So are you hearing from the electorate still concerns and also suggestions about what individual action and community action we all should be focused on?
Well, I think people who are concerned about climate, and I'd say there's a vast majority of people who are trying to do what they can in their lives to make a difference. But I think it comes down to where the real difference will be had is the legislation, the policy settings that we put in place. We know, as you alluded to, that climate change is the greatest threat to world security and to Australia's security, not only from movements from nations around us, but also from within our own nation, internal displacement as well. We've already had a taster of what's going to happen potentially with floods, with fires, and that's internal dislocation as well. There's people still without homes in the Lismore area and from fires, and that's years down the track. So that's the type of impact we're looking at, and we have that group of former security leaders, military leaders who are warning us that we need to act on climate change, not just within our own country, but also in other countries as well, so that we are supporting them to also decarbonise. Because it will be a major threat to our health, a major threat to our economy, and a major threat to our security. So people do have this as a background concern. Although we have cost of living is hitting people hard in the face at the moment, there is this background concern that we do need to be acting on climate change in a meaningful way. And I think there's a lot more that can be done. We do need to set the 2035 target. That's going to be a big challenge going forward in the next couple of years, or less than that, the next year as well. What's Australia going to do with our 2035 target? Because we absolutely know that if we want to leave a livable future for both our children, our grandchildren, and future generations, then the time to act is absolutely now, before 2030. So that 2035 target is really, really important. So it needs to be an ambitious one. If we're leaving decarbonisation until the 40s or the late 2040s, then it's way too late.
It was not renewables that we were hearing discussed the last couple of days. The federal opposition leader raised the N word, nuclear. So related to that, a question Guy, one of your electorate, sent in, I'd like to bring in, he says, do you feel the nuclear debate is getting any serious traction in Canberra, or is it seen as a political distraction that's been discredited and will fizzle out?
Look, I think it will be a serious debate, particularly in the lead up to the next election. Without a doubt, it will be driven strongly, I think, as a policy platform by the Coalition and particularly the Nationals. And so when we look at the nuclear debate, we have to look at it, as I say, nuclear is not political. Technology is not political. Technology doesn't have an ideology, but it definitely does. The technology that we choose, there is this technological determinism where the technology we choose does actually determine the future of a country or of a nation. So we're at this crossroads, this really important crossroads. So when we have the debate, we've got to stick to the facts. Like most things, as a doctor, I like to stick to the evidence and the science. So look at reliability. What will give us the most reliable source of energy? What will give us the most affordable source of energy? What is actually feasible and what is timely? And so if you're looking at a lot of those things, and I think it was really important recently that the head of the CSIRO came out and said, you need to stop to the Coalition, you need to stop undermining the work that is done, the scientific work that is done by the CSIRO, because we need to have that platform of truth. We do actually have to have that platform of information that we can rely on. So stop undermining the work of the CSIRO. And it's very clearly, to date, the renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy, and it will be the cheapest form of energy, and it's getting cheaper. When you look at long duration storage, the price of that, I was just at a conference recently, the price of long duration storage of battery and other forms, there's also new types of forms, is coming down, and it's coming down rapidly. So that the competition, the race will almost be run by itself between the technologies. It becomes an easy choice. I sort of was thinking of it in terms of being a doctor. If you have a patient and there's a couple of different types of treatments that you can offer, and you say, right, there's two different types. There's one that is ready to go now, that is cheap, it will be effective and has minimal side effects. On the other side, there is another one that will also be effective for you. You can choose that. It'll be way more expensive. It's not actually in the country at the moment. You'll have to wait 2 years, and by the way, there might be really severe side effects. Then that's the choice that you have to make. So, we're having a debate about, I think it's important to keep the debate about the reliability of the grid, the affordability. Cost of living is a massive issue in this country we're facing right now. If we want to build our manufacturing base in this country, as we would hope to do, because our future economy relies on that, then we need to have a cheap and abundant source of electricity. So the issue, when we talk about reliability, I think it's really important to talk about timeliness. It comes down to time. So what's happening at the moment is Australia currently gets over 50% of our energy, our electricity, from coal-fired power stations. We also know that most of these power stations are at the end of their life, They're old, they're end of life, and 90% of them are due to be closed down by 2030. That's the trajectory that we're on. So being old, they're unreliable. So if we wait to do nuclear, we know that large-scale nuclear power plants will take 15, if you're extremely optimistic, 15 years to build, and that's extremely optimistic. Probably 20 years. We also know that the small-scale, small modular nuclear is not currently available. And I think just last week, well, it was just last week that another report was released to say that a mature market for these small modular nuclear reactors will not be available to the late 2040s. That's too late. We've missed the boat. We haven't acted on climate change, and in the meantime, we've had to rely on coal-fired power stations, which will become increasingly unreliable and increasingly expensive. Just to keep the Eraring power station open, the coal-fired power station open, for a further 2 years, which New South Wales has decided to do, needs to do, will cost New South Wales taxpayers $500 million. So that's the type of cost that you're looking at. And one other thing I would say is that just one nuclear reactor, looking at the UK, that's currently being built, will cost $88 billion to build. That's one. And so that is an enormous amount. So if you're looking at 5 major nuclear power plants, that'll cost, they're predicting up to $600 billion, and that's in today's terms.
In the same area of expertise as a GP, we've had a bevy of questions come in for you. One is about Medicare from Liam. Especially in Mackellar, many doctors do not bulk bill or even substantially rebate. How might you work to address this, and would you support more dental coverage under Medicare?
Thank you. Thanks, Liam, if you're here. Yes, so, I mean, I 100% believe that healthcare is a human right. It absolutely is a human right, and we should be doing everything to make healthcare affordable in this country. We're a wealthy nation, and we should be making it as affordable as possible. I also know, having been a GP, and I had a bit to do with the College of GPs recently, who released a Health of the Nation report late last year. And in that report, it showed that 80% of practice owners felt that they were concerned about the viability, the financial viability of their practice. And that sort of comes down to the fact that there was a freeze on the Medicare rebates for several years, which really made it tough for GPs to continue to be able to bulk bill but keep their doors open at the same time. And I know a lot of practices don't fully bulk bill, but they will try and bulk bill the children and concession card holders. But I really that's one of the things I've been pushing the government on, is to increase the Medicare rebates again in line with, or even more in line with inflation, because we need to catch up as well. Is that I was really pleased to see that the government in the 22-23 budget increased the bulk billing incentive payments, and that has increased the number of people the number of bulk billed consultations quite significantly. So that's pleasing to see, and I'm continuing to push for greater Medicare rebates. And then in the last budget as well, it was another thing that I pushed for in my pre-budget submission, was to increase the rebates. But one of the rebates that was increased was for the longer consultations, which is often ones for mental health and also for women's issues. Often you'll have female GPs doing these long consultations and really not getting remunerated for them as they should be. So yes, it's something that I will continue to push for, because I do believe it's important that we have access to good, really high quality healthcare, but for all Australians, not just people who can afford it.
We're still dealing with COVID in this area in most of Australia, and several people have sent in questions asking whether you would support a federal review of both the public health response to the COVID pandemic, but some of the controversies in some minds about vaccines, and even very sensitive cases about hospital patients refusing to be vaccinated as they sought surgery. Now, there's a lot in there, but do you support that suggestion to have a federal review of the whole pandemic response?
Yes, absolutely, and there must be, and there is. The government at the end of last year announced that there would be a Commonwealth Government review into Australia's response to the COVID pandemic. and including in that was the vaccinations and the vaccination harm as well. There was also a committee inquiry, a health committee inquiry into long COVID. It was into long COVID. It wasn't about the vaccinations, but in their recommendations, they also recommended that there should be a central database. So we're sort of on the cusp of creating that Australian Centre for Disease Control like they have in America. And that's one of the things that has come up, that we were lacking a coherent sort of orchestrated response. It was very haphazard. It was very on the run. You know, the states were doing different things. We'd stopped pandemic preparedness years before. We used to have pandemic preparedness exercises every 2 years, and that had stopped sort of 20 years beforehand. But that collection of information and data is really, really important. And part of that is how many people were vaccinated, how many people were harmed by their vaccines as well, but also how many lives were saved. But the basis of being able to act and respond comes down to information, and that information needs to be collected. But that is what I think. There is an inquiry happening at the moment into the government's response, the Commonwealth government's response, and I think it's really good that all that information is fed up into that body so that there can be a coherent response to that.
Do you think RFK Jr.'s campaign in the United States, however, will revive doubts about vaccines in general? And what is your position on that, given your scientific medical background?
Look, I think most people who talk to me about vaccines are not totally against vaccines. I think that the history has shown that, you know, we've nearly eradicated polio, smallpox, and many other diseases. You know, it's such a helpful thing when it comes to meningococcal meningitis. You know, there's a lot of things, even human papillomavirus is the cause of cervical cancer. So there's a lot of great benefit. I think most people recognise that. I do think, though, there needs to be an avenue for people to be heard who have been injured by vaccines. But we also need to look at the flip side as to what were the benefits of the vaccine program as well. And recently, I think just a few months ago, RMIT and Monash universities reported that I think there was 18,000 lives were saved in Australia from the vaccine program. But at the same time, that's not to diminish. There are side effects with vaccines, and they also that data needs to be collected, and the people who have had that happen to them need to be heard, and I think there needs to be a direct avenue for that.
I was interested to read earlier in the year in one of your newsletters that you've been working on the so-called sugar tax. The idea is to provide a disincentive to reduce the consumption in the obesity epidemic, and that this could have a benefit for children. You might actually educatively begin to wean people off that particular toxic substance. Where's that going now?
Oh, thank you. No, that's a big piece. So there's two bits of work there. One was my Healthy Kids Advertising Bill, which was all about the marketing of junk food advertising to children. It being targeted to children, particularly online. I mean, there's so much our children are bombarded with that we aren't even aware of. Because they're in the bedrooms, they're watching their tablet or whatever, and they're seeing junk food advertising. But at the same time, they're probably seeing alcohol advertising and gambling advertising and pornography. So there's a lot that needs to be done with those algorithms and the platforms. But one of the things that I've been trying to do is how can we limit our children being exposed to that ubiquitous junk food advertising, because there is that pest of power that comes in, and I know if I see a junk food ad, then I immediately probably want to start eating it. You know, it's a natural response, isn't it? And then the other side of that, I was on the health committee that did an inquiry into diabetes, and that's where that sugar levy has come in, and actually calling it a reformulation levy, because what the intention of that levy is to encourage companies that are producing these foods to reduce their sugar content, to reduce their fat or their salt content, so that they actually come below the threshold where they have to pay that tax, or people have to pay that tax. So it's actually a reformulation levy where you're driving companies to make their products more healthy, and that's is what the evidence is showing is what's happening in other countries. And other countries around the world are already doing this, and I think we can follow suit from a place like the UK, which has seen this implemented and seen that reformulation happening as well.
Mark mentioned my work with Aboriginal people, especially in the remote areas, that avalanche of renal illness that flows from poverty, poor diet and being trapped in that circumstance. It would make a significant difference if we were able to take that out of the food lineup, add nutrition and take away the harmful.
Well, I agree. It's such a harmful substance in so many ways, and we know that it's more vulnerable groups who are suffering more with diabetes. When I was training as a GP, type 2 diabetes mellitus was sort of seen as a middle age, and above. If you're 40s and above, you might start seeing that come on board for patients. Now we're seeing it in children, and now in younger and younger children, and particularly in Indigenous groups, so much so that they're getting the complications of diabetes, like the kidney failure, in their teenage years and looking to have transplants in their teenage years. And it's also in other disadvantaged groups as well. So in Western Sydney, there's an enormous amount of diabetes, and it's not just that it's that disease in itself impacts that person. It's all the complications that come from diabetes: heart disease, amputations, blindness, kidney disease. There's so much that goes on, and it not only costs the individual and those families an enormous amount in their sense of well-being and financially and economically, but also it's an enormous cost to our health system in terms of billions of dollars. So just doing public health interventions will make an enormous difference, both to the health of the population, but also the budget bottom line. Yeah.
What do you think others will say is your proudest accomplishment in this first 2.5 years, and perhaps your biggest disappointment, both for Mackellar but also nationally?
Let's see what others might say. I know can I say one that I would say, which I think not everyone's aware of, but I'm very proud of the fact of the Jobs for Mates work that I've been doing. And I introduced a private members bill with that, and as normally happens, that's not usually taken on by, a private members bill is not usually taken on by a government. They will introduce their own bill, but pushing every single time there's a new body or a new organisation, a Commonwealth body, then trying to really get into our system that we need to have greater independence of that appointments process. So the thing that I'm particularly proud of, because the most egregious example of that was the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, where that body was so heavily stacked with political cronies that it had to, in the end, be abolished. But the setup of the new body, the Administrative Review Tribunal, and just remember, this is one of the most important institutions that underpins our democracy, reviews any of those Commonwealth government decisions that affect people. Whether it's Medicare, NDIS, immigration, all those things. So it's a fundamentally important institution. It was going to be set up in the same way that the old institution was set up when it came to appointments, so that it would be open to the same flaw, in that it could also be stacked by ministerial appointments. So I was able to, one of the amendments I brought in was saying that we need to have independent selection panels for this body, and I'm really happy to say I was able to work with the Attorney General on this, because he also knew it wasn't going to get through the Senate as it was. So I was able to work with him quite constructively. He chose to work with me, and basically had that conversation. How can this be happening? How can we be creating a new body with the same flaw that was there last time? So now the way it stands, did manage to have a huge amount of success on that, and that is that there is now mandated and legislated independent selection bodies where it comes to the appointment of new members to that body. And I think that's a huge gain, because it sets a precedent for the type of body that can be set up in Australia, and ending this Jobs for Mates culture. So I think that's a huge, that's what I'm proudest of.
Well, as well as these constituents, one named Julia had written in asking what you were doing on that front. And I think it's a very Australian feeling that pollies in particular need to be held accountable and follow the money, and often lead you to very worrisome things. So I think we all appreciate that you're looking at that. And as you've explained, there are limitations to what any individual parliamentarian can do, but you believe that you're navigating a way that an independent can actually contribute on some very original fronts where others might leave it alone.
Well, exactly. That's the thing. A lot of people say, well, what sort of influence can an independent have? And I think one of the really important roles that an independent does have on the crossbench is, introducing new ideas that, like you said, neither of the major parties will touch, and also socialising that in the media and the conversations that are happening around the dinner tables as well. So when I talk about that type of thing, if you look at the last election, who would have thought that one of the top issues for people prior to the last election was the fact that we didn't have a National Anti-Corruption Commission? I mean, I think most people wouldn't have known that 5 years prior to that, but it was driven by the crossbench and others to make it a major issue at an election. And then the people chose to make sure that that was something that would be implemented. So it's about continually spotlighting, raising new issues, and making sure that the conversations that need to be had are being had. And the same to be said about climate action in the last election. Zali Steggall did an amazing job making sure that we were going to get a climate target. She kept banging on about that non-stop. So, and the media spotlights that more. There's conversations happening around dinner tables and across the country, and that's what drives change in this country. Quite often it's the people who demand the change, and it's about bringing this information to people and bringing new ideas. But also, as you said before, holding the government to account, working constructively with the government at the same time, working constructively across the parliament. We meet with both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. The Labor ministers will let us know what legislation they're introducing. We will meet with the Liberal Party as well to hear what their take is on it, so that you're getting a balanced view of things. And I think that's a really constructive way to work.
Others in this area are focused on the war in Gaza and the last 24 hours, the risk of escalation after the Hezbollah alleged attack on the soccer field in the Golan Heights. One of your constituents named Phil asks, would it be possible for the Teals to work on Labor to recognise Palestine as a state?
Thank you. It is incredibly concerning. The one thing I think nobody wants is for the conflict in Gaza to extend into a regional conflict and then potentially something more. So I'll just respond to the Teals. The Teals, we have worked on some things together, but the Teals aren't a party, so we do what reflects our community's wishes. One thing that we did work on was making sure that humanitarian aid and support to the UNRWA, the UN agency that was supplying aid, the vast majority of aid, the vast bulk of aid was coming through UNRWA, and making sure that humanitarian aid got back. So there was an open letter where we all sort of joined forces and made sure that was well known. I think, and I think there's a lot been happening in this space just in recent sort of weeks as well, where just in recent days as well, I think the ICJ's International Court of Justice's ruling that the settlements and extreme settler violence was illegal, and then the Australian Prime Minister, along with his Canadian and New Zealand counterparts, sort of asking for a response to that, I think was really important as well. And again, calling for an immediate ceasefire. I think that there needs to be pressure for an immediate ceasefire, because the death toll in Gaza, if you just look at it from a humanitarian perspective, is just horrific. And whenever we talk about what's happening in Gaza, we know that there is distress and major distress and trauma on both sides. So when we talk about anything to do with Gaza, we also are talking about the hostages, which must be returned to families where they can be as well in Israel. But nobody wants to see this become a regional conflict or an even broader conflict that involves the world. So it is. I think those measured responses that the government has been doing are a way of maintaining social cohesion in our own country at the same time, because there's groups that are hurting terribly within our own country.
Within Mackellar, there's been a very strong awareness of environmental issues. They were prominent in your campaign originally for office. You have taken some action that I don't think most people would know about to try to limit logging and state forest logging that would have an impact on the excessive land clearing. Are you making any progress on those fronts, or is this one of those things you realise there is inertia on some of the most important things for the country?
Look, there is some inertia, but it's interesting. We've got a way we sort of talk about things sometimes is just nudging, just continuing to nudge in a particular direction, and ending that native forest logging is a really important thing, and I think we are nudging and I think we are progressing with that. I can see movement. So the native forest logging, the timber industry in Australia is 90% plantation based and 10% across the country is still native forest logging. We know in New South Wales it is massively loss-making. It's not financially viable, so it has to be propped up by taxpayer subsidies, and I think in last year's, up to $40 million of taxpayer subsidies. So we are paying, we as taxpayers in New South Wales are paying for native forests to be destroyed, and at the same time we destroy these native forests, we are destroying our threatened species. So just a couple of weeks ago I went up to visit the Boulder State National Forest, which is an area due to be logged shortly by New South Wales Forestry Corp. And we know that there are greater gliders living in that forest. They've been spotted, but we're in this bizarre, this crazy kind of situation where the EPA in New South Wales, the Environment Protection Agency, is so weak that the loggers are able to say, we've done our spotting, we've looked for these threatened species, they don't exist, but actually when you look into it, they've looked for nocturnal animals in the middle of the day, so crazy things like that are happening. But this isn't, they're not being held to account for this. So there's movement happening. One of my, I think you were talking about disappointments, was that there hasn't been more movement on the environment laws. I think everyone was hoping that that would be done and dusted by this term. There's a lot of work to be done. But there is movement in that we didn't have a national Environment Protection Agency. It did not exist, and we obviously need that. And so that has gone through the House, and that will be established. But we need a lot more to be done in the meantime. And so ending native forest logging is one of those things that I'm really working on.
In this area, I remember the tiny gliders in my own garden, and we walk past the trees now where you can still see their markings down old trees, but you don't see the gliders. Has the overdevelopment, I would call it, in this area contributed to this loss of species?
Well, I'm sure it has, yes, because, just the fact that you lose trees, you can't just replace it. So those animals would need trees that are 100 years old or more, because that's where they get their hollows that they live in. So cutting down a native forest that is home to threatened gliders and things, you need 100, 150 years before that can then house again those species. And so that's why there's such devastation, and why our extinction numbers, why we are world leaders when it comes to extinction, because we are also world leaders in deforestation.
I think through Voices of Mackellar, you've always had very acute, clear reports about what we, the people, think is happening in this area. One of the suggestions that was sent in by Alex online, do you feel there's a space for a community consultancy that would help inform you of big issue views? And if so, how would you envisage such a consultancy working?
So that's a great question. Yes, because how does that information get fed in? Because we try and do this where people can ask questions and I can feed back, but also we did something recently which I'll talk about, which was the People's Jury on Housing, the Mackellar People's Jury on Housing, because I can take a position, but I need to be hearing from the community so that I can genuinely reflect that down in Canberra. So what we did was the process called deliberative democracy, and we partnered with a group called New Democracy that is expert. It's a not-for-profit but expert in the area. And what happens is we want a true reflection of our electorate. So people are randomly sent an invitation to join the jury, and then people then indicate whether they're interested or not. And then it's sampled so that it does truly reflect our community. So in age, in demographics, all sorts of things, whether you're a homeowner or a non-homeowner, whether you rent. So try and get a true reflection of our community. And then that jury was able to come together. They heard from a broad spectrum of experts with a wide range of opinions. I actually wasn't involved in the day. I'm not there because I don't want to influence it. So they hear from the experts, and the experts stay, and then they deliberate and come up with decisions themselves. And they have to come up with a consensus of opinion on what they feel would be the top priorities for me to take to Canberra. And so we've recently done that process. I think that deliberative democracy process is a really powerful way to strengthen our democracy and to bring back trust in our democracy as well. Because if people are feeling that they're shut out of their democracy, then it's just not working for them. So people being able to be a part of it, be involved, to participate is a way that we really strengthen our democracy. So those types of things. And we're also, I try and hear from as many constituents as possible. We have people that come and see me, but also doing a lot of roundtables this year and the end of last year on particular issues that I know are coming, that we're hearing about frequently. So we recently did a round table on men's mental health, which was fantastic. And I've been doing a lot of work on mental health as well, particularly adolescent mental health, with what's going on with the Northern Beaches Hospital. But we're able to bring people together and then come up with ideas and then work towards that. So one of the things that has come out of all this work and listening and sort of advocating on behalf of more services here in the Northern Beaches for mental health is that I'm now having conversations with the Primary Health Network and working with the local area health district to see if we can have a pilot project here on the Northern Beaches to better have community access to mental health services. So there's a one-door process for everyone and a hub where people can get their information and make sure that people are feeling connected to those services.
Before we take some more questions from those here today, you haven't yet told us what your biggest disappointment is after your first 2.5 years. Okay, biggest disappointment. So I think it was an eye-opener. My biggest, when we got in, there was, at the election, getting action on climate change was a really big piece of why I was elected and many of the other independents were elected. So when the safeguard mechanism legislation was being debated, one of the amendments I put in was that any new coal or gas project needed to be net zero from day one. So that was in the safeguard mechanism. And when it went through to the Senate, it actually got in. It actually was legislated that any new gas project, not coal, but any new gas project had to be net zero from day one. So for me, that was an enormous win. I couldn't believe it. But what I realised was, not long afterwards, that Freedom of Information has shown subsequently that under pressure from fossil fuel companies like Santos and other trading partners, they were quite upset about this. So then a pathway was created around this. So that's where you saw the sea dumping bill come in, and the sea dumping bill was to legislate to allow carbon capture and storage to occur in under Australian seabeds. So that was kind of like, oh, okay, now we can see. And the thing about carbon capture and storage, I think the best you can say about it is that it's unproven. The worst you could say is it's completely failed. And if you look at what happened with Chevron's Gorgon gas mine, and it was supposed to, there was an enormous carbon capture and storage project there. I think after $3 billion, and I think you can call it an utter failure. So to have this
gas field expansion in Australia occurring being justified by carbon capture and storage is probably what I see as the biggest disappointment.
Thank you. Some questions now here today for Dr Scamps. Start with
Can I just mention, knowing that we're a passionate, caring community, with these questions, if we could be respectful in the discussion, because I know we're a lot of passionate people here today, and considerably tough. Thanks.
Respectful, that's actually a really nice segue into a question about truth in political advertising. After the abject failure of the referendum and the disappointment and heartbreak that followed that, and the frustration that we feel when misinformation and disinformation is paraded with impunity during election campaigns. Where are we at with that?
I think we're getting somewhere with that. Thank you for that question. I really feel we're getting somewhere with that because there has been a lot of work that's been happening, I think, behind the scenes on electoral reform, and as I understand it, I haven't seen a draft of the legislation, but I think it's due to be released soon, and I think truth in political advertising will be a part of that based on the model that's been active for many years in South Australia. So I absolutely agree. People need to know, have information. They need to have information they can trust when they're making decisions about that type of thing. It is fundamentally important. So I look forward to debating that, and full credit to Zali, who's been pushing truth in political advertising for many years now, for some years. So I think we're getting there. It'll be interesting. The government has said that they will release their draft legislation on electoral reform very shortly. So that will be debated, I think, up until the end of this term, and that truth in political advertising will be a piece of that. Yeah. We've been working, pushing behind the scenes hard for that to happen. Yeah, thank you.
question over here.
Hi Sophie, it's Bill from Citizens Climate Lobby. Nice to see you.
Hi.
Love your work.
Thank you.
Now you probably know what I'm going to ask, but I'm going to do it anyway. The government tells us that we're on track to meet our 2030 emissions reduction target. What they don't say quite so loudly is that nearly all of that is because we're supposedly better at land management. Very, very little is because we're actually emitting less. So if we introduced a carbon tax with cash back to households, we could inject $50 billion per annum into households to help us all decarbonise. Do you think that's a good idea? And if so, how can you help?
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. You've spoken to me about that idea in the past, and I think we need to do what we can to help households decarbonise. I mean, we're looking, like you said, the land sector, that avoided deforestation is one of the reasons why we're saying that we're going to meet that target. But also, most of the focus has only been on the one sector, the energy sector. We need to be looking and having targets for all sectors, I would say. So agriculture, transport, all those different things, they need targets as well, so that we have a pathway towards that. I also think that like talking about the electrification, what's happened in America, let's electrify everything. That will help us. Sorry, I'm just trying to gather my thoughts. I've lost my track of thought. So, electrifying everything is a big step in the way that what we can do with our households. So, if we have the solar panels on our roofs, but at the same time we have the batteries, because at the moment what's happening, we have a large proportion of houses having solar panels on their roofs, but what they're missing is the battery storage. And so we're having this glut where there's a whole lot of electricity being fed back to the grid in the middle of the day, but when we most are using it at the end of the day, then that's a problem. So if there were greater subsidies for batteries, for behind the meter storage for batteries, that would be a great push as well. But I have to talk to you again about your idea. I'm not sure that the government's hearing that at the moment. It certainly hasn't been spoken about as part of the policy. But I think that electrification push, and I think also balancing out what's happening both in the regions. We can't put the whole burden of responsibility on the regions for all those renewable projects. we in the city in the urban areas also need to be pulling our weight. So all that rooftop solar, that space for rooftop, there's so much space for more rooftop solar to go on, and we have some of our solar advocates here, I think, in the audience as well. So happy to hear from you more.
Up to back on the right, I think a hand was up.
Oh, it's me.
You were just off to the restroom.
No. Sophie, a lot of the time when you and the Teals are pictured by the media, you're in a group of 6. Recently read there's going to be anywhere between 17 to 19 more Teals coming into the mix for next year's election. I'm curious what you and the other 5 might think about you actually having the balance of power in the new parliament next year.
Thank you. Look, I think that would be great, but optimistic. There's 6 or 7 of us. There's also, I mean, often when you call the Teals community independents, there's others as well that are on that crossbench, like Helen Haynes, who's not considered a Teal, like Sharkey, like Andrew Wilkie, others as well. So I think it's been interesting. I think we've shown, prior to the last election, there was a lot of sort of rhetoric around well, it would cause chaos if we didn't have a majority. You know, having these independents there would cause all sorts of problems, and how will we get anything done? But I think we've shown that we've worked very constructively across the political spectrum, but also with government in trying to improve the legislation that they're bringing in, and helping them in many ways to bring things, more new ideas and better ideas, and to make legislation better. It will be interesting. I think the next election will be interesting. Which I should say as well that Australia is one of the very few nations around the world where there is often a majority government. In many, many places around the world there is minority government, and even if you look at the coalition is a coalition of a minority government, the Liberal Party and the National Party. They have quite different opinions on some issues, and so you can work constructively in a minority government. Would love it if a larger group of people who were reflecting the true concerns of their community were in that balance of power. I think it would be really constructive. I think it would be able to bring forward new ideas, and actually, you know, the way that things have been going in this parliament, I think there's been a lot of tinkering around the edges. What we need, because we're facing massive crises, a crisis in housing, crises with our environment, a crisis with the climate, is we need more courageous reform in many ways. And an intergenerational inequality is also coming up hard against us. I think it's well understood that there needs to be tax reform of some description, and helping to have those discussions and those debates, I think, will be really interesting in the future as well. Thank you.
Lucy from DY has a written question for you. The Northern Beaches has high rates of alcohol-fueled domestic violence. How can we, as a local community and as a country, do more to address this?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think we were all a bit alarmed just last week, or when it came out, that the Northern Beaches has the highest rate of domestic violence that is related to alcohol. I won't say we have the highest rate of domestic violence, but the highest rate related to alcohol. So that's a wake-up call for us, isn't it? And it's also just that acceptance that domestic violence happens across all communities at all times. And we're not very well funded here in this area, because we're often seen to be a privileged society that may not need the same amount of supports as other places, but we can see that we do need the support. I know that many of the women's refuges in the area, they tell me that they have to turn away dozens of people each week, of women and children are having to be turned away. They can't, help them out. So we do need to have far greater support on the front line, I guess, as a start for domestic violence. There needs to be, you talk about education and culture, but maybe it's not only education, but also just that understanding that there are peaks, there are spikes of domestic violence around sporting events when alcohol is consumed. And I think some awareness around that is really important to know as well. there's so much that needs to happen on that, and there needs to be, and I think that domestic violence and violence against women will be one of those issues that continues to be a big agenda item going forward in the rest of this parliament, but also going ahead into the next election as well and the next parliament.
You might remember that in Fitzroy Crossing it was a group of women who led the campaign to turn the grog flow down a little, and the reduction in domestic violence and perhaps more critically fetal alcohol spectrum disorder was measurable, and it became in Western Australia a transformational approach to remote area health and wellbeing. And I would only add that to the suggestions you made that we can do something ourselves, but we've got to approach the liquor outlets and turn down the grog. If it helps turn down the violence, it's an individual and community response. One more question written down for you, Catherine from Mona Vale. Do you foresee any changes in early years education in the future?
Yes. Hopefully, yes, fingers crossed. And that's another thing that's been worked on really hard as well, is the fact that children who are missing out on preschool education or early education start behind the 8 ball and they never catch up. So it's shown throughout their education they will never catch up to those children that had good preschool education. So there's a real push on with the parenthood, and I think for all children to have access, 1 or 2 years at least, all children across Australia have access to good quality free preschool education. I think it's really important to treat it like you would a public school education, not just, it's an extension of that. We also know if there's accessible and affordable early childhood education, then that is not only fantastic for our children in many ways because they are having those early education years that then help them as they go forward, but it's also allowing another half of the population to return to work. So it's actually a really important pillar in growing our economy and that participation in the economy as well for women, and also for women's independence and rights as well. I mean, it's very difficult to go back to work if you can't get good quality care that you're happy with and that you can... Because at the moment, I'd say, people can only use a certain amount of childbirth care before it's actually costing them more than what they're earning themselves. So it is a real problem. There's a lot to be done there, and I think that that's another space that we need to look at. Gender equity, it's a gender equity issue, it's an economic issue, but it's also one for our children. It's the best outcome for our children often in many ways.
Question up the back there.
Hi, Dr Scamps, James Brown's my name. Thanks to you and Jeff and the team for a great session today. If I can take you back to the issue of housing, you mentioned right at the start that you think there needs to be a debate between housing for housing's sake and housing for investment. Could you say a little bit more about your policy on negative gearing reform? If we're going to be cheeky and ask a second question, are you open to supporting a coalition minority government if that's the circumstance in 2025?
Well, like your questions, thanks James. Yes, of course, and it depends what the outcome of the election is. 100%, as I said, we work across the political spectrum in a constructive way, hearing from both sides. So I think it is a bit of an innovation that the Labor government is able to come to us with legislation that they're introducing, but also it's probably an innovation as well that the coalition has been working with us so that we're hearing from them as well, so that we do know where both sides are sitting, what their reasoning is for certain things, and the motivation behind things. So I think it's a really good way of working, so 100%. The debate on housing, so with the housing, I'll be holding a housing forum again soon, because what happened with that housing jury was, as I said, I wasn't a part of it. The people came together and deliberated and came up with what they were suggesting were the best solutions towards housing. So that's something that I need to reflect upon, and then we'll be responding to that in the coming weeks as well. But interestingly, of that group, 96%, by far the most popular way, the thing that basically everyone agreed on, was that there need to be a change in the settings for tax incentivisation and that type of thing, which was interesting.
Some more questions there.
Hi, my name is Don Norris. I have a question that started to come up as you were speaking about these different big issues that we're tackling. You talked about food quality, you talked about education, you talked about petroleum, and on and on. But the thing that in my mind occurred is that these things all involve businesses who have a successful business in large part because they can externalize some form of cost. In the case of petroleum, they externalize the cost of the impact of their product use. In the case of the alcohol industry, they externalize the cost of domestic violence. Same thing with the gambling industry, which externalizes the cost of people going dead. Again and again, you have the same dynamic. And it struck me that really we end up talking about all these problems, and it's the same elephant in a funny way. There's this way of doing business that's accepted, and folks, I don't propose this instant solution to this, but I think it's good to think about this. If you have any initial reaction, I'd love to hear it, and please don't feel you have to say something. I can just be the crazy person everybody's kind of stuck.
Externalising the cost.
Well, no, there is an externalising the cost. So when you think about diabetes
Yes.
and the junk food, companies bombarding our children with junk food advertising, what actually is they're making money out of the ill health of our children in many ways. And look, I love a chocolate bar as much as anyone, but that's the thing. The child will suffer from a life of chronic ill health. So what happens there? So it's interesting that the committee inquiry into diabetes then did suggest this levy on sugar sweetened beverages, and that the money that would be collected from that would then go back and to help the prevention of diabetes and things like that. And I guess that's then internalising it in some way. So there's a couple of drivers there, but I mean the main thing is to make those products healthier so that people who are consuming them aren't as harmed by them. But I understand what you're saying.
Question right next door there.
Thank you for this afternoon and the opportunity. Education. I recall the last federal colleague who advocated against public funding of independent schools was Mark Latham. I'll stand corrected on that. We all know that he drank a bit too much Kool-Aid. We do have an increasingly divisive education system. I don't think the independent sector will die if public funding was withdrawn from it. When will that conversation, if ever, is it likely to come up again to basically to benefit the opportunities in the public sector and rather than allow it to decline and there become this greater difference between what's available in the public education system, where I teach, and the private sector, which is increasingly getting wider. It never raises its head in discourse.
I hear you on that as well. Thank you for that question. Thank you for asking about education. I think actually one of the most shocking things that I've witnessed just in my term, 2.5 years or so, was when I was invited to go to Narrabeen Sports High to see the physical state of the school there. I mean, I found that utterly devastating, that a high school, a stone's, on the northern beaches, and I'm sure this is across the country everywhere, was in that state of disrepair. Such was the disregard for those staff and those students that they had been left, that was their learning environment, and that is not a sustainable way to care for our, the people that will then lead our country in the future. So there does need to be a conversation to be had, and I know that there's other schools that in our regions that are in a similar state, and this is happening across the country. So we need to have a good public education system as the engine for the rest of our country going forward. We absolutely have to invest in our public education. I hear you, that conversation has not been had very loudly during this Parliament, but it is something that I'm very interested in as well. I've been The thing with being an independent, you have a very small staff. I have one kind of parliamentary advisor, so you have to pick your issues to go on. But I think that education is one that has really not been spoken about nearly enough. I do think that there is a lot happening in the tertiary education sector. There's been changes there, but again, tinkering. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, the young lady first of all, right there, and then we'll come down.
I just wanted to bring up some of the issues that young people are facing at the moment, particularly the housing crisis and HECS debt. I'm just wondering what you were doing just to support young people during the cost of living crisis and with those particular issues.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. And I think it's really important that young people do feel that they're heard and that their government is working for them as well. So one of the things that we did support was that HECS debt being indexed more fairly. And again, because I think what was happening is people were finding out they'd paid more by the end of the year, their debt had actually increased more than what they had paid. So it's starting, and it does put young people on the back foot when it comes to being able to afford to buy a house. It does impact their ability to take on loans and debt if they do want to buy a house in the future. So you're starting on the back foot, and it's just not fair. So trying to make that HECS system fairer is one of the things that we're working on in this Parliament and look at going forward as well. And then housing. There is a growing intergenerational divide where younger people are finding it harder and harder to get into the housing market, and we know that when, say, in the 80s or 70s or 80s, it took 3 or 4 times the annual income to be able to get a loan to buy a house, that's now 7 or 8 times. So it's so much harder. So we need to look at making it fairer for young people to be able to get into the housing market. It's such a fundamental piece of the equality in our nation as well. And we do know that intergenerational inequality is growing and growing as we speak, and it's got to crisis levels. Yeah.
So a question over here first, and then we'll come to you.
Where do you stand on the COVID vaccine mandates that are still enforced at the Northern Beaches Hospital?
Can you just say a little bit, enforced inside the hospital?
Working at the Northern Beaches Hospital, they still insist on 3 COVID vaccinations.
Personally, look, I think it's for the hospital to decide on that measure. I haven't had any input into that, and it's a private hospital, so it's a private entity that has chosen to do that. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. So the question was mandates in general, vaccine mandates, and I do think it's a really important thing that the inquiry looks into, because that inquiry, the Commonwealth Government inquiry, is going to look at how Australia responded to the pandemic. And Australia was unprepared. A lot of the world was very much unprepared. We were not prepared. And so that's going to be a part of the inquiry as well. So I look forward to hearing from it. There's a lot to have learned, and I think a lot of it is that information that gets fed in and the data that gets fed in, how many people have been harmed, what type of harms were there. And I think we need to take it seriously, so that there is, that there are recommendations that come out of that. So it will be really interesting to find out what are the recommendations coming out of that inquiry. And that will be something that I look at, and happy to look at it with you too. Yeah.
You've been waiting patiently. Yeah.
Hi Sophie, I'd just like to find out, as a GP, what is your how you can convince the state and federal government to actually give or to convince people with disabilities with employment, with a better pay and, with the same qualifications, whether they are out of school or not, and I've spoken to you this once before, so I'd like to get your views on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for raising it again. And it's about how we get people with disabilities, how they get the same pay and same opportunities in work opportunities, because it's often really hard to find a job for people who've got a disability, to find a job even though you've very much got the capacity to work. So it is something that I think we need to continue advocating for, and so that's one of the reasons why I'm having an advisory group with people with lived experience to find out what you need, what your suggestions are, and how we can feed into government and how we can advocate on your behalf as well. Because I think there are so many people out there with capacity to really contribute in many, many meaningful ways that are missing out at the moment. So look forward to working with you on that. Thank you.
Any other community questions? Let's do this fellow first who hasn't had a chance. We'll come to you. We've got a few minutes still.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sophie. I'd just like to commend your work with this government, a government that's backsliding and crab walking away from many of its own promises. It's just empty words with them and nothing more. With some of them, a very difficult position. But I'd like to ask about the methane reduction pledge. Now we know that methane is 60 to 80 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. So when you multiply that factor into the CO2 equivalent, methane is a huge problem, which there's recent new technology for estimating what the fugitive methane is in reality from what the various fossil fuel companies have been able to cobble together to say, oh, well, we'll only have this much and that much. It's 60% higher, the methane, fugitive methane in this country. And the government, Chris Bowen, made a big thing, words, but we've signed the methane reduction pledge, but it's not binding. And the problem with that is that if this 60% more methane escaping in Australia is correct, and it's based on good scientific evidence, we cannot meet our 2035 targets. And somehow or other, it's a huge task. We need to hold them to account to their good words. What we want is good action.
Yeah, so thank you. It is a real issue. There has been a vast underestimation of how much methane is leaking from different mines and pipelines as well. So it's been vastly underestimated. And I think what's happening currently at the moment is trying to get some really good evidence around that when the evidence is there, but trying to bring it all together, and the government needs to respond to that because it will dramatically change what our whether we can meet our targets and what the 2035 target will be. You're right, methane is up to 60 to 80 times more potent greenhouse gas, so it is an issue that needs to be looked at, and again that's been driven by the crossbench, that shining a spotlight on this issue is a really important one that the crossbench has been doing, and will continue to try and hold the government to account on that.
Could I just add to that? What we really need in this country is a national standard of assessment of methane, fugitive methane. As it currently is, each big fossil fuel producer engages their own scientists and they come up with a figure. None of them relate to one another. We need a national standard, and we also need to employ the most recent escape methane detection apparatus, which includes satellites nowadays.
Thank you. You should share your knowledge with us all after Dr Scamps has finished. We'll have to make this the last question.
Thanks very much, Sophie. It's not actually my question. I'm asking on behalf of one of my chooks, Susanna, and the black swan I was chatting to on the lake the other day. Concerned as to whether we are any more prepared for the looming H5N1 bird flu virus than we were with COVID.
Look, very good question. Maybe we are because we had the last pandemic. Hopefully there's some lessons learned, but the work that's been done on the current inquiry, hopefully they're soon to report as well. But there was a lot to learn. We stopped doing pandemic preparedness back, in the early 2000s, and it really shouldn't have happened because we know that these pandemics are going to be happening more and more frequently as we encroach increasingly upon wild animal habitat. So we do need to be ready. One of the other things that's happening that's a little bit controversial for some people, but I've had a number of conversations about as well, is trying to increase at the World Health Organization level increase the sharing of information around the world. So if there is an outbreak, making sure that there isn't this secrecy, that actually that information is shared in a timely way, so that a pandemic doesn't have the opportunity to spread before it's actually, can be controlled, so that we don't end up with another pandemic in that way. So more transparency and around information sharing. If there did happen to be another pandemic, making sure that there is a greater sharing of resources as well, and greater preparedness, because we saw an unequal response between countries that aren't wealthy and what wealthy countries were able to do and buy up the resources, and then there was a real lack for other countries as well. So they're looking at all those kind of supply, how we prepare, how we have the resources necessary in order to respond quickly, so that it doesn't end up being a worldwide pandemic again, hopefully.
To round things up, when do you think the next federal election might be? We all want to know. And what will you do with the remainder of this term, and going into your next term, if elected, what would you focus on?
Right, so when will the election be? I think, as I keep hearing, the only person who knows that is Anthony Albanese, but I have a sense, and I really don't have any evidence to back this up, that it will be next year. I think it'll be next year. So I'm hoping, because it's gone so quickly, this two and a bit years have gone so quickly already, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. Particularly what needs to be focused on is the housing stuff. We really need to be starting to look at that. Another big disappointment was that the fact that our national environment laws have not yet been strengthened. What will probably happen is the Environment Protection Australia body will come through, but the environment laws themselves will not be strengthened. So there needs to be a lot more work done on that as well. There needs to be setting a target, the 2035 target. There'll be energy debates. There'll be work that needs to be done on domestic violence. Also at the moment going through is the NDIS work, so that we can make sure that that is sustainable into the future and fair. And then one of the things that I think is really important to me is this intergenerational inequality, so that we are looking after younger people and this growing divide does not continue to grow. So looking at that, one of the things I've been really interested in is what has happened in Wales and Scotland. They've got legislation that is called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And in Wales they have a commissioner, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Commissioner. And that's something that I'm interested in for the next term, is that how do we embed long-term decision making into our policy, development processes? How does that happen? So we're not always just responding to this really short cycle, and we have a very short cycle in Australia, I now know, for 3 years, comes and goes around very, very quickly. But how do we make decisions so we don't end up with all these crises? We do know we've got several crises going on at the moment. If we had responded, if we had been able to have this long-term vision into the future, then we wouldn't be facing a lot of these issues, the housing crisis, the environment crisis, all those things. So looking at how we do that and sort of modelling what has happened in those countries as well. It's also really important to know that the way decisions are made in Australia at the moment, there's very much siloed thinking, so that policies are developed within each ministry, within each sort of sector. So what you'll find is that the industry and resources sector will be in conflict to what the climate change minister is wanting to do and the environment minister is wanting to do and the health minister wanting. They're all sort of in opposition or conflict with one another quite often. So what they did in Wales was they have a framework on how decisions are made, and it's not just one sector, it's multi-sectoral. So the example I give of what happened in Wales, the Commissioner mentioned, was that they had a problem with traffic congestion in Wales. So, okay, the answer is pretty knee-jerk reaction. If you talk to Roads and the Roads Authority, okay, we need another road, we need another freeway. But actually, if you use the framework decision, then you look at, okay, what is the impact of that decision on our public health, on the population health? What is the impact on our environment? What is the impact on climate change? You come up with a very different answer, and the answer was that they needed greater investment into public transport and active transport, because that is going to have a benefit in all these other domains. So having it's a much more sort of logical way of doing things, where you actually don't have sectors working in conflict with one another, but in concert together, so that you're embedding better health, better environmental outcomes, better economic outcomes, all in every decision that is being made. So that's something I'd like to look at going forward.
Thank you all for such thoughtful questions, and those that were sent in online as well. Would you please put your hands together for Dr Sophie Scamps?
Thank you to Jeff as well. Thank you for...
My pleasure. My pleasure.